think for me, one of the things, going line by line, helped me see the parallels or the different contrasting things, and then sometimes it wasn't line by line that was the contrasting things, but it was maybe pairs of verses that did the same thing.
Yep.
And I guess one thing that I found interesting was in verse 5 when he was asking the question, why be beaten? Why rebel? You're doing this and you're being punished. Why do you keep, it was almost like, why do you keep doing this when you know you're facing punishment for doing this?
Yeah.
But it reminds me of when Chad was a little, and we had an entertainment center, and he loved knobs, and it was like we would tell him, no, don't do it, because we would spank his hand if he did it again, and he would, like, in defiance, look back at us and just grab the knob. It was kind of like that. Why are you doing this when you know what's facing you?
Mm-hmm.
But and it seemed like that was God didn't want this. He wanted something better for them, but this was the result of their rebellion.
Yeah, I love it. Very good. That's a great treasure, Bobby, and I got a treasure for you. $5 gift card right there to Starbucks, which is coffee. Might not be the best coffee, but it's coffee. Do we have any other treasures that we found?
Well, I have a question.
Yes.
In verse 8, the daughter of Zion has left the vineyard, the shelter in the vineyard. What is that in relation?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So the context of this idea is we have these several verses where we have all this punishment language, right? And so for me, when I was kind of delineating out where stuff is, I kind of grouped verses 4 through 9 together. That's kind of how I saw those all working together. So it's this. It starts with this woe, and then it ends with this, unless the Lord had left some of us survivors, we would have become like Sodom and Gomorrah. And then it transitions to talking about them like they're Sodom and Gomorrah in order to repent. So that big set of verses are all working together. So verse 8 is kind of in the middle of that. So it says, daughter Zion is left like a shelter in a vineyard, like a hut in a cucumber field, like a city under siege. And so daughter of Zion, so we're going to talk about this idea today. So that's kind of a metaphor, but it's also something called a metonymy. And so we're going to talk about what that is today. But it's this idea that the city of Jerusalem is a daughter. Okay, it's a woman. So that's how most cities are usually described is they're female, they're women, they're marriageable women. And so if you're a faithful city, then you're like a good wife. You're like a faithful wife. If you're an unfaithful city, then you're like a harlot. And so daughter of Zion, she's so after all this destruction, she's left like a shelter in a vineyard. And so the shelter in a vineyard is this very temporary thing that you would set up for your workers during the harvest season. You'd set it up so that they could work from the field. Like they could sleep in the field and then they could get up and keep working. But it's a temporary structure. It's not sound. It's not going to last more than the season. So that's kind of what it's talking about. So a hut in a cucumber field, the same thing. Like a city under siege, is trying to wrap all those things up. That this is a very tenuous, barely left, barely surviving kind of situation for Jerusalem.
Just the overall tenor of the chapter. Verse 21, how the faithful city has become a harlot.
Mm-hmm.
She who was full of justice, righteousness once lodged in her, but now murders. And you have this difference between God and man. God will call it what it is, but then he also holds out hope. We, on the other hand, frequently dispossess people, or we disown people, even in families. When there is a conflict, there's a separation without any chance of redemption. God, on the other hand, holds out redemption.
Yeah.
And he's a redeeming God, so
Yeah.
it's a lovely thing.
Yeah, and so this is chapter 1 of Isaiah, right? So this has been crafted in order to help us understand the whole of Isaiah, the whole message. It's, we can expect that this chapter is going to give us a comprehensive introduction to what Isaiah is about, what the whole book is about, what the prophet is meant to say to Israel, both in his time, but also for the readers of Isaiah, which is likely after the time of Isaiah, right? All these prophets are coming. They're in the Hebrew Bible that these people are using hundreds of years after the exile in order to understand and process what's going on. Why did we go into exile? Why are we now under the boot of the Persians or under the boot of whoever it is? And so they get to figure that out and process that through the scriptures here. And the conclusion seems to be, this happened because you were unfaithful. This happened not because God is weak and couldn't stand up to the other gods, but because you were not doing the things you ought to have been doing. Any other treasures from homework that we wanted to talk about? Okay. Guess I'm going to save my gift cards for next week. I have 2 more. I'll just be handing these things out. And then that's the other thing I wanted to talk to y'all. Oh, Jan wants a gift card.
No, I don't need a gift card. But anyway, I did notice in, excuse me, in verse 11, where God was telling him that I don't want any more of your sacrifices, your bulls, your rams, your lambs, incense. It's all an abomination.
Mm-hmm.
So before, that's what made him happy, and now he's disgusted.
Mhm.
So.
But it's important to understand why. It's not because he's rejected the sacrificial system. It's not because that it used to make him happy and now it makes him mad. It's because the end of verse 15, I think, is key to understanding the whole of this chapter. It kind of culminates at this point. It says, when you spread your hands out in prayer, I hide my eyes from you. Even when you offer many prayers, I'm not listening. Your hands are full of blood. So it's this image of I'm coming to the temple to pray, and I have the blood of the innocent on my hands while I do it. And so that idea is contradictory. That I'm pretending like I'm worshiping God, but really I'm doing all these things, like in verse 17. I'm not defending the oppressed. I'm not taking up the cause of the fatherless. I'm not pleading the cause of the widow. Verse 21, I'm not defending the cause of the fatherless. The widow's case doesn't come before them. It's those ideas that are central to what's going on.
Is this not, though, God leading or insinuating to the future now that it's going to take Christ to take the place of the animal sacrifices?
Yeah, I'm sure we could think about that more, but to me it doesn't seem like he's calling them to get rid of the sacrifices. It seems like he's calling them back to justice and righteousness. That's what he wants. And so once they square their actions and they get rid of this, they get rid of their foreign gods. They start acting righteously in the way that Torah lays out, then they can return to the temple and bring proper worship. Okay, so today we're going to talk about metaphors, and hopefully everybody's a little bit familiar with what a metaphor is. The way that I'm going to define it, so if you like filling out the worksheet, nice and neat like my wife does, then we're defining metaphor as a comparison based on the correlation of 2 concepts. Okay? And so today I want us to think a little bit more about how this idea works, because I think that's going to be helpful when we interpret the Bible. Because sometimes people think about metaphors and we think about them as, by the way, there's 2 sheets to the worksheet. If you only have 1 sheet, there's 2 to it this week. Sometimes there's confusion about metaphors, because when we think about metaphorical language, we think about, in a sense, it's not literally true. That's kind of what a metaphor is. And so if I say, my wife is a beautiful flower, that's not literally true, right? She's not a flower. I'm trying to take certain aspects about flowers and compare them to my wife. And so metaphors work that way. And so in the Bible, when we see metaphors, it's important to understand how they're working and how they're not working. The things they are saying and the things they're not saying. So we're gonna work that out a little bit today. So on your worksheet, I have two circles, and I'm gonna talk you through exactly how this kind of works in language. And so the first one we're gonna talk about is the idea from Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. Okay? So the Lord is my shepherd is this powerful image, and it has two concepts. So there's the source concept and the target concept. Now the way the metaphor works is the target is the source. So the Lord is my shepherd. So the Lord is the target, and the source is the shepherd. Okay? And so if you were to fill in the source circle all the different things that have to do with shepherds. So just name things that have to do with shepherds. What are shepherds? What do you know about shepherds?
They tend to flock.
They tend sheep. Okay? What else?
They smell like a sheep.
They smell like sheep.
They're by themselves.
It's a kind of a solitary job.
They live with the sheep.
They live with the sheep.
They protect the sheep from
Protect the sheep. Yep. Are shepherds rich people? No. Generally, the youngest in the family was sent to go tend the sheep while everybody else does the hard, heavy lifting. Just like, call us if something bad happens. Anything else we know about sheep?
They're under threat.
Yeah, there's things that want the sheep, right? So they're protecting the sheep. So one thing to notice is that we don't know a whole lot about shepherds. We know a little bit, and most of it that we know is probably from Bible studies and things that we've done, but we don't have a lot of interaction with shepherds on a day-to-day basis. But in the ancient world, everybody knew about shepherds. And you would know shepherds, and you would know, and maybe you had shepherded the flock that your family owned for a little while you were the youngest kid until the next kid was old enough to come out and take over the sheep herd. So that's something important to know, is that when we're thinking about metaphors in the Bible, they might know things about things that we don't know, or they might know different things. They may have a different understanding of a concept than we do. So that's something to know. Now,
So you suggested one thing, our time frame is so different, our culture's so different.
yeah,
And Jesus had the same situation in his travels when he'd go from Bethlehem to Nazareth to Jerusalem. These stories and these metaphors don't necessarily travel from culture to culture, even in Jesus' own time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I never thought about that within Jesus' context.
So you're
But
watching
the
changes.
place that he does, the place where he's presenting something is going to be important.
The place that he presents it decides how he actually uses a metaphor.
Sure. Yeah, and when he's talking to fishermen, he's going to be using fishing metaphors. Okay, so we've filled in the circle of our ideas. You don't have to actually fill it in, but we've filled in the circle. So those are all the things we know about shepherds. What about the Lord? What if we filled in the Lord? What kind of things could we put in what do we know about the Lord? Yahweh.
He's omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscience.
He was at the beginning,
He's the creator, he's all powerful. What else do we know?
prophet, priest, king.
Okay, so Jesus is Yahweh in human form.
The Alpha and Omega.
Okay. So there's lots of ideas for both of these ideas. Okay, and what I want to convince you of today is that for a metaphor to work, you're actually framing out just a few certain ideas and you're mapping them on to the target in order to better understand a certain aspect of the target. And so when I say my wife is a beautiful flower, we know lots about flowers, right? They need water to live. They have to grow in soil. They are beautiful. They are colorful. And so lots of those, so there's lots of ideas, but I'm only trying to convey a few of those ideas and map them on to my wife, okay? And so as we think about the source and the target, we need to remember that metaphors are limited and they're trying to convey certain ideas about Yahweh. So if we were to frame out the ideas that we think that this metaphor is framing, what would those ideas be? And especially in the context of Psalm 23, because metaphors are always going to work within the context that they're in. So the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me by side green pastures and quiet waters, and restores my soul. You know, all that stuff. What's this metaphor trying to capture? What ideas about shepherds is it trying to map onto the Lord?
He's my guide.
Okay.
He's my protector.
Yes.
He is.
Personal relationship.
He knows what's best for me.
Yeah. Relationship knows what's best. So it's a limited amount. So things like things that would be outside the frame are things like he's poor, he's probably young, he's probably unwashed, right, dirty and out in the field, like those kinds of things are probably outside of this frame. But there are ideas that are inside the frame based on the context of Psalm 23. Okay. So does that make sense how that mapping works? Anybody have any questions about that? We're going to do a couple examples in Isaiah 1 to get a little bit more practice. So does anybody have a favorite metaphor that they saw in Isaiah chapter 1? I know we weren't looking for metaphors last week, but there's some good ones in there. By the way, this is what my homework looked like.
The dog ate it.
And so I've just bought a pack of highlighters and then I labeled them based on different poetic devices. And so whenever I read poetry and I'm trying to understand what's going on, I just go through and I go one color at a time and I say, okay, today I'm going to look at the metaphors. And so I just highlight every metaphor in the whole thing as I'm slowly reading through. And the next day I'm going to read through, I'm going to find the parallelisms, I'm going to find the chiasms, I'm going to find these things. And so that's what's just trying to get my attention. So and then that way I kind of build up my knowledge, and then as I'm slowly going through, I can understand everything together and how it's all kind of working. That might be something you want to try. But is there a metaphor in here you think is especially good that we should look at?
How about verse 10?
Verse 10. So calling the rulers.
Sodom and Gomorrah.
So Israel is Sodom, right? Sodom and Gomorrah. Is that the metaphor? Okay. So Israel is Sodom and Gomorrah. So which one's the target? Which one's the source?
Israel's the target.
Yep. Sodom and Gomorrah is the source. And so if we're thinking about Sodom and Gomorrah, what are all the things we know about Sodom and Gomorrah?
Wicked.
Okay, they're wicked. They're kind of the go-to wicked example in the Bible.
Rebellious.
Rebellious. Yeah, so Interestingly, in the first story about them in the Bible, they're rebelling against these kings that they were supposed to be subject to, and they go to war with these kings, and the kings that they were rebellious to beat them in battle. A bunch of the people flee into tar pits, and so those are things that we can know about Sodom and Gomorrah. Inhospitable, right? So the whole story about Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot is about the that they're inhospitable to guests. So Abraham, right before then, he hosts these three men, which turn out to be God and angels. He hosts them and he feeds them and he gives them water and he lets them rest in his tent. And then the story right after that is Lot attempts to host them within the city, but all the city want to come in and assault them. And so when you look at this story and how it's talked about later in the Bible, is the primary thing is that the city of Sodom and Gomorrah is not hospitable. And so we can, there's this sexual element, which is, we can talk about that. But the primary thing that this story is trying to convey is that they are not looking after the vulnerable. They're not looking after the traveler who in the desert is somebody who needs your help. And so you always host and you always help the traveler when they come into your town. And Sodom and Gomorrah do not do that. And so
Maybe their destruction or their punishment would be.
Yeah, so they were wiped off the map, right? They don't exist today. Okay, so those are the ideas. Now, the target is Israel, okay? And so, we could spend a lot of time talking about all the things we know about Israel. But let's think about, in this context, what are they trying to frame out from Sodom and Gomorrah and map on to Israel by calling them the leaders of Sodom, the people of Gomorrah? What is that metaphor doing? How's it working in this context?
They're saying that Israel is equally wicked and all the other things that Sodom was guilty of.
Yep. Yeah. So there's some sort of transgression that they have undertaken, okay, and that they're doing. What else?
Judgment.
There's judgment involved, right?
Surely come.
So they're not doing the right thing. They're acting like the leaders of Sodom. They're acting like the people of Gomorrah. And Sodom and Gomorrah, it didn't turn out well for them because there was no righteous people in the city, right? Once Lot left, it was a free fire zone. There's nothing good left there. And so there's this idea of judgment that's coming.
They're at risk of their reputation becoming the same as Sodom and Gomorrah,
Yeah.
which has no positive side to it in this day and age,
Nope.
and they're at risk.
Yep. Yeah, and part of that's connected to God's name. They're supposed to be God's people, and they're doing this, but that's probably not within the frame that we're talking about.
Wasn't there, though, a difference being that Sodom and Gomorrah, God annihilated them and wiped them off, but Israel, being God's chosen people, he would only put them in captivity, but bring them back. So.
Yeah. So I think that there is a difference, but this metaphor is working. It's trying to help the Israelites understand how serious the threat is. It's not saying there's always going to be a remnant, so don't worry about it too much. It's this threat that God has done this to people before. And if you aren't going to change and reckon with what you're doing, then this is going to be a serious problem. What are some things outside the frame, just to kind of put a bow on this, what are some things outside the frame that aren't translating over? We kind of mentioned one with this reputation idea that Israel is God's people, right? But Sodom and Gomorrah are not God's people. And so, though that's in the target concept, it's not going to be within the frame of this metaphor. But it is something interesting to think about in its implication of Israel's history, and especially with this remnant idea too. Is we know that God has promised blessing through this people, so He's not gonna wipe them all out. But here He's threatening to do it. So I think this is helping us to see exactly why we ought to take this threat seriously.
Well, they were referencing a beautiful place, that's why a lot of fishing's tent out there. Out there, was a great place. And, there are these beautiful seas, and it's a beautiful area, and that's not part of what he's talking about at all.
Yep. Yep, exactly. So I think we're getting it. Any last questions on metaphors before we move on to metonymies? And if you're following along on the thing, a couple more things I didn't mention. So the categories within the Bible and within ancient writing, one of the reasons I wanted to bring the symbolism ideas first is because I think that those are kind of preloaded categories that everybody is kind of using now. That all the cultures are working off the same kind of understanding of the cosmos. Now there's differences between cultures, like most cultures believe that there are many gods in conflict and trying to, they're trying to pick a winner and sacrifice to the right God, whereas Israel is God is the God of gods. He's the one that's all powerful, that created the cosmos, that is the only one worthy of worship and those kinds of things. So there are some differences, but for the most part, this understanding of the cosmos with heaven above and earth below, with this cyclical view of time and decay and destruction, those types of things, in opposition to space. So those are the categories that they're using. If you look at like modern poetry or modern songs don't necessarily use or even find a footing in those kinds of metaphors. So artists will come up with crazy, weird, new. It's called a novel metaphor. So I'm going to compare a random thing to another random thing and find some similarities, and it works, right? That's kind of how language works, is we kind of invent these new things. But that's something important to the Bible to understand, is that they're not making things up willy-nilly. They're using categories and ideas that are well known, well understood, and so when we study the Bible, we have to expect that. So that was why we spent 4 weeks talking about those categories and ideas, and we'll hopefully point some more of those out as we go along. So last 7 minutes of class, metonymy. It's a fun word to try and spell, and then let Word correct your spelling of it. So the definition is going to be, it's a kind of standing for based on correlation within a single concept. Carrie, can you advance? Oh, you already did. Great. An example of a metonymy, I'm just going to give you a few examples because I think it's the easiest way to understand it. So if I said all hands on deck, what's that mean? If I say all hands on deck.
Everybody.
Everybody what?
Everybody.
Help out.
Yeah, everybody's helping out. Everybody's coming to do something.
Yeah.
Okay? So the metonymy is the hand. Okay, so the hand is the small part, so it's the small frame within the whole concept. So the part stands for the whole in all hands on deck. Okay, so the part stands for the whole. So when I say all hands on deck, I don't expect people just to put their hand into work. Right? I want everybody here to help me work. What if I said 2 heads are better than 1? What's that mean?
2 together can work out a problem.
Okay, but what's it mean by head?
Like what?
By head in that phrase, 2 heads are better
Well,
than
2
1.
people, two
Yeah.
objects.
Yeah, two people. So again, it's this part for the whole. The head stands for a person, but we use this language called a metonymy to stand in, to standing in for. But again, it's not trying to take two different concepts. It's taking a part of one concept to be a substitution for the whole. She owns a Picasso. What's happening there?
She's a possessor of something very valuable.
Yeah. And what does she own?
A picture,
Yeah.
something, a noun.
Yeah. She owns a painting, right?
Yeah.
She owns a painting by Picasso. But we're using the name Picasso to stand in for the part. So the whole concept might be Picasso's life work, and so it's the whole for this one painting. So it's called a Picasso, but we don't, if we went to her home, we wouldn't expect to find a clone of Picasso enslaved there. We would expect to find a painting because that's how our language works with this idea of metonymy. So you can do part for whole, you can do whole for part, and you can also do part for part. Let's look at Isaiah 1:25 here. And it says, I will turn my hand against you. Now what is it? So this is God speaking to Israel. I will turn my hand against you. What does it mean by hand? My hand there.
Vengeance.
Okay, vengeance. So his wrath, something like that. Okay. So is this working part for whole? Is this working whole for part? Or is it working part for part?
Well, the hand can either help or hurt,
Yeah.
and it represents the whole of God. He's going to turn himself against them.
Okay. But the whole of God is like, he's the creator. He's the all compassionate and gracious one, right?
Right.
So I would say this is part for part.
Okay.
Okay, so this is the hand of God, which is a metaphor, so it's a little confusing. But it's the hand of God standing in for the vengeance of God. So this is kind of a part of God standing in for a part of God. Okay, so this is kind of the three different ways that metonymies can work. So part for whole, whole for part, or part for part. Okay. And they're different from metaphors because it's not two different things, two different concepts. It's one single concept, and the frames within that concept are standing in for each other. Can we find the metonymy in 1 verse 4 and tell me what kind of metonymy it is?
The one that I think is kind of like the one you just talked about was turn their backs on him.
Yep.
So it's kind of like turning your hand against him, but turn your backs on him.
Yep. So how's that one working?
That would be part for part.
Yeah, maybe part for part. So if I turn my back on you, that's like I'm turning my allegiance away from you. So maybe it's part for part, or maybe it's part for whole, that I'm turning, my whole self is turning away and going away from you. But we just say back because it's a metonymy. It's just how language works. Last one, 1 verse 3. Okay, how's that one working?
I don't know. This is a big guess.
Yeah, I think it's close. I think Israel in the line before that is working as a metonymy. And so all of Israel does not know. And so all of Israel, I think, is actually a metonymy standing in for part of Israel, and it's the rebellious part, the part that is not acting rightly. Maybe it's all of Israel. Maybe there aren't anybody faithful, but in context, we know that if Isaiah is speaking to it, the kings Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, only one of those three kings is like really, really bad. Or sorry, one of those four kings is really, really bad. The other three are actually pretty good kings. And so when it says Israel does not know, I think that's a whole working as a part. So it's this idea that there are people within Israel that don't know, and that's how it's functioning. So does that make sense for metonymies? Any questions, comments? So the reason that I'm trying to explain these two things is because I think it's helpful to slow down when we're reading the text and understand exactly what's going on. And so having a good understanding of how these things in language function is going to help us better understand what's going on. And when we see something strange like that, we say, oh, I know what's going on here. That's a metonymy. And a metonymy works in this way. So this is standing in for something else. And so now I can better understand what the author is trying to get across. So with that, we'll wrap up today. I do have lots of homework on there. So we have three. So if Isaiah 1 was too much, then maybe 3 chapters would be way too much. But we'll give it a shot. I got 3 poems or songs that I put on the homework. If you take a couple days for each of those this week, then I think you're going to find it to be very helpful in getting better at those things. 10, 15 minutes each day, and I think you'll have a much firmer grasp of these concepts. I know we're already over time, but I just wanted to say something real quick for this class. One thing that I've been talking with the elders about is how Springbrook's culture, for some reason, for as long as I've been here, classes haven't been taken super seriously. It's kind of optional whether you do work ahead of time. It's optional to really learn a whole lot in class. And I don't know about you, but I'd like to change that kind of culture within Springbrook. I think it would be good that if we thought that classes were a great time to exercise our discipleship. Classes are a great time to learn more about the Bible, to learn more about our walks with God and who we are and who we ought to be. So I think if we could start taking the homework seriously, then I think that would go a long ways to making participation's a lot easier when I know a little bit about what Thomas is talking about. But it might not be as easy to participate if we're not doing the homework, if we're not at class on time, if we're not doing these kinds of things. So that's all I want to say. I got the carrots with the Starbucks card, and I got the sticks with the talking to the end of class. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.